Good evening. And I know everybody's tuned, listening to the latest political developments in Israel, the new prime minister. So I know you will spend all night and the morning hours discussing, debating what's the next peace process might look like, or the non-peace process. Probably I will be doing the same in the coming days with my friends and colleagues. But thank you, Hanan, for the introduction. Thank you, Rachel, for I don't think we've met, Rachel, but I'm assuming you are the one assisting me, so I can be here this afternoon with you. So thank you. My goal is to speak for about maybe 20-25 minutes and then have a discussion on the subject matter and the topic. I've made a note on my cell phone. It is also muted, so it will not silent, so it will not bother us along the way. Maybe I should begin by saying that I am not from the United States. I was born and raised on the island of Cyprus, from a refugee family, Greek-speaking and Turkish-speaking mixed family on the island. Some of you might be very familiar with if you visited or studied or read about the peace process on the island of Cyprus. And that's where I was born and raised. Family of refugees. My mother was originally from Istanbul, Turkey, who eventually ended up on the island of Cyprus, left in the 50s. On my father's side, I was born in Budapest, Hungary, left during the Holocaust time, ended up on the island of Cyprus on the way to Holy Land, but decided to stay on the island for used to be a British colony for many, many reasons. So that's a very mixed identity family. Along with my siblings, we always felt, or not personally felt, but we were always put onto the minority side. So it was always nice to be raised and live in a community that I was always seen as a minority. And I don't like using the word minority that much, but that gives you a little bit about my background. I don't know if you can hear me okay. I'm just got the sign that my Wi-Fi is on and off, but it should be strong signal. Okay. Very quickly, in addition to Cyprus, I studied at George Mason University at the Institute. It used to be called the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I attended many conferences. I did my doctoral work there at George Mason, and I focused back in the late 90s, beginning of the 2000s, on this notion of comparative peace processes. And situations like Israel and Palestine, Northern Ireland, Bosnia-Herzegovina, South Africa, and many, many other cases that life is too short to analyze all of them, but I know some of you are good analysts and good followers of those situations. And I've always been intrigued how identity and conflict, or conflict identity and peacemaking or peace building it's all linked together. And I would like to share with you a couple of lessons learned by being traveled and live with various communities of people or peoples in these places of that we know as peace processes. I'm not an expert of conflict resolution. Over the years, I moved into other areas of academia to serve students and promote diversity as well as internationalization on the campuses that I work with. And always find it fascinating how people, young students, younger generation of students coming from divided communities have so much to share, so much to tell us, so many lessons learned that that help us understand their communities. Hundreds of students have met, Israelis and Palestinians and Bosniaks and Bosnian Serbs and Croats and so-called Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland and so-called Greeks and Turks on the island of Cyprus. And the story goes on and on. So many communities, so many students that I got to work with. So I will stop here. I don't know what else to say about the introduction other than I'm a father, spouse, parent. My pronouns is he, him. I have Ches with me. He's a year-old puppy. He's somewhere in the house because my kids and spouse are in the swimming pool at the moment. I don't like swimming pools, but I'm here with you. And if you allow me for a moment, I'd like to share my screen with you. And believe me, this is not a long presentation. It's not a long academic presentation. It's only 5 slides, 5 lessons learned, if you like. And then we open it up for a discussion. If there is anything you would like to, any points for clarification, please use the chat box. I see it here. I'm trying to at the same time see as many of you as possible. The chat box, send me a quick note. Hanan and Rachel, if you don't mind, along with me, please monitor that in case I miss any comment, and I will be happy to elaborate. If not, we will definitely have 50, 60 minutes for the discussion. So let me see if I can share my screen with you. 1 second. Thank you for bearing with me. Let me see if I can put this from the beginning. I changed the title a little bit, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. Conflict identity and peace building, it's a very, very complex phenomenon. And I thought it might be easier to focus a little bit more on this notion of lasting peace and people's peace processes, what Hanan and Roots and many, many other folks like you and me are doing to bring peace in our communities and stop these cycles of violence. Please feel free and call me Eleftherios. There is no need for formality. And this is the quick blurb I put together when Hanan asked me to share a few words about the talk today. I didn't include Israel and Palestine or here because I do that on purpose. If I speak to an audience in Northern Ireland or in the 6 counties, I don't include Northern Ireland. If I speak with an audience in Cyprus, I delete the word Cyprus. That way I don't have to target examples and situations that might be emotional to some individuals. So I will be using examples parallel to the one you know and live in, and create parallel knowledge, if you like. 5 important lessons. Let's see the first one. This is the knowledge that we all have. Excuse me for a second, my coffee. I'm a big coffee drinker. This is one attempt to capture this notion of a peace process. And we all know it, peace process means different things to different people. This is one attempt in a previous publication that I have that focus on this notion of what's a peace process, how do we know it exists? And here is the 5, 6 points very quickly I would like to know. We know that it has this process or processes of signaling. Hey, let's get together, let's solve this issue. And you know the story of the Oslo back in the 90s. That's when I was a student and started hearing about the Oslo peace process. And it caught my attention as a grad student. And I even visited the land, the Holy Land, and meet with folks back in 1992, 1993. And the process continues. Preliminary contacts, let's talk about the different issues, pre-negotiations, substantive negotiations, accord completion, and eventually post-agreement or post-accord implementation. These 6 or 7 steps that are very important and we see in almost every peace process that we can name. The most important thing here is these external factors and sometimes internal factors. And this is where the people's peace process comes into play. And the lesson learned here is that we cannot have a successful peace process without folks like you, all of you, the type of work you do. In Hanan, you call it roots. Some other colleagues call it forming their own non-profit organizations. If we go through a list of non-profit, pro-peace organizations in Northern Ireland, in Cyprus, in Israel, in Palestine, in so many, many other places, would be hundreds of organizations. Myself, a few years ago, I started a non-profit called Technology for Peace. Actually, it was 22 years ago. And it was along this notion of technology, the email, and email and say, oh, email, we can talk to each other now electronically. Can you imagine that? I'm telling my son who is 10 years old that years ago I used email to communicate across division zones in Cyprus and say, Mohammed, how are you? I'm Eleftherios. How's life on that side of the island? And all of these non-profits. So that's the lesson one. We cannot have a successful peace process, whether it's in Bosnia-Herzegovina or where we live these days, even in our divided communities here in the United States, without the involvement of civic society, of the non-profit organizations, the pro-peace ones especially. And please stop me if you want me to elaborate more. Lesson number 2, which is equally important. This is a little bit of a complex system of spectrums here, but that's okay. I'm not going to analyze all of this. Point number 2 is that, and it is very important in all of the peace process where we have the officials, the track 1 official diplomats handling negotiations, to also have the unofficial peace process, the people's peace initiatives, the people's peace process, where they sit together and we sit together and sing songs and have coffee and we talk about everyday life. That's very important in getting in what we call about conflict transformation, conflict prevention, sustainable and restorative elements of justice. And those are very much needed. We see the work that's been done in Northern Ireland since the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement back in the 1990s and later on. We see the Dayton Peace Accord in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Republika Srpska and the work that has been done in terms of truth and reconciliation and so many, many other places, 20 plus places where official truth and reconciliation committees have been established. South Africa, a big example. And I will share with you one of my interviews years ago, one-on-one meeting with Desmond Tutu on the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And I asked Desmond Tutu, and by this example, I like to also emphasize the importance of faith-based organizations, the work that you, Hanan, and your group and Roots is doing. How important faith is here in the peace process, especially faith-based organizations that aim in bringing peace and restorative justice and reconciliation. In that meeting with Desmond Tutu, and that goes back in 1999, I was a grad student, and my work was my thesis was about peace paradigms, and my goal was to interview important peacemakers, the ones who received the Nobel Peace Prize, as well as ones, many of them that were just ordinary people doing amazing things in their own communities. And in that meeting with Desmond Tutu, as the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was taking place, and I had this discussion with him, and he said to me, in addressing the question of what's truth and why is needed, and he said, it's like the coffee we drink today. You like it black? I said, yes, I like it black. I like a little bit of heavy cream on it. It's black and white. And that's what South Africa is all about. It's like having a cup of coffee between the black and white South Africans, the tribal communities. And some like the coffee in black, some like it mixed with milk. That that was a message that new South Africa could coexist that way. Something that even Nelson Mandela later on used in another talk, the metaphor of the coffee and the cream. This is what lesson 2 is all about here, is how do we move from these highly official processes into the grassroots, the work that you and I do, the work that ordinary people do in the communities we live in for peace, for coexistence and beyond. The next lesson I would like to emphasize for you, it's this, it has to do with this relationship between concessions, leverages, and constraints. And I know that I'm getting into negotiations theory, and believe me, I will not bother you too much with negotiations. This is a classic example where in all of the cases I've studied and I've been studying, civil society, faith-based and non-faith-based pro-peace organizations can use their leverage, can use their contacts, international contacts, everywhere. Look at the interaction we have tonight, to use the leverages and pressure for changes towards lasting peace, for a more successful peace process, if you like, a more sustainable peacemaking initiative, if you prefer. We know that in negotiations, it's all about, not only, but it's a lot about concessions. What am I going to take? What are you going to give? Well, I know that's a simplistic way of explaining that, but imagine the type of leverage that all we can use in putting more pressure, in changing minds, in changing paradigms, in introducing new peace initiatives. And my list is long and long and long initiatives. If I could mention one, you probably all know, is the Geneva initiative between Israelis and Palestinians, the Oslo initiative. Archaeologists from Norway and archaeologists, Palestinians and Israelis, Arabs and Jews sat together, have a cup of coffee, they had a meal together, and they started a peace process together. Now, did it collapse? Yes, for other reasons, but not because of the people's peace process failure to sustain it, for political reasons. So leverages, concessions, and constraints. This triadic relationship is very important, at least in the context of my investigation, in sustaining successful peace processes. Lesson number 4, then number 5, and then we get into discussion. Number 4. I know this looks a little bit complex and might need a little bit of a time to analyze it, but thing of divided communities who often get stuck in this, within this paradigm of a status quo. I think of Cyprus, my birthplace, divided island. I remember growing up and not being able to move from south to north. And my friends living in the north, they couldn't go to the south. All of that changed around 2004 because of the accession of the island into the European Union. And that changed the dynamic quite a bit. And people can go back and forth. And that's a very positive development. But the status quo, then division remains. And that division keeps everybody hostage. The potential for a peace process, the potential for unification, the potential for my nephews, my nieces. By the way, I'm the only one from my family who lives in the United States, and my spouse who's born and raised here in the state of Maryland, and my 2 children. The rest of my network and family and what I call home is all back on that island, 6,000 miles away from here, 150 miles from Tel Aviv. A few weeks ago, there was an important meeting on the island, took place actually in New York City under the auspices of the UN Secretary General, to break the deadlock, to break the impasse and bring the parties back to the negotiation table. There hasn't been any substantive initiative for peace for almost good 15, 16 years now. The last one collapsed around 2004, 2005. It used to be known as the Annan Peace Plan. I had a little bit of an involvement in co-facilitating some of the discussions, and I served as an assistant to Alvaro de Soto. Alvaro de Soto was a Peruvian diplomat who was appointed by Kofi Annan to be the chief negotiator. After the collapse of the Annan Plan, as you know, Alvaro de Soto was sent to negotiate between the Israeli and Palestinian elites, along with Tony Blair, for a short period of time. And that initiative collapsed quickly. In few words, in I found that communities that are left alone to negotiate terms for sustainable peace always push them boundaries way beyond for an endgame solution that political elites often are not willing to go. And that's the potential that we have here. I will come back to it later on during the discussion. The last one, and I promise this is the last one, and Hanan, I'm trying to stick within the 25-minute, 30-minute max timeline here that I have. Think of this one in terms of identity formation, identity transformation, how negotiations are conducted, and then dynamics within negotiations, if you like, the inter-party negotiations, the intra-party negotiations. Is the new prime minister going to start a new initiative? Is Hamas going to be included in negotiations? Is PLO, is the Palestinian Authority, who is going to represent the Palestinian Authority and such? All of those questions and discussions take place within this inner circle. I think I labeled this as layer 1, if you can see my screen.
Hey, just to stop here for a second, there's some questions in the chat asking what does IO stand for?
Yes, IO, it's integrative outcome. IO stands up, I apologize. That will be an integrative outcome, and I apologize, I didn't get into the details. So this is the desire to get an integrative outcome, and an integrative outcome is exactly what Hanan mentioned in the beginning of this meeting. how can we live together? How can we share our land together? Okay, and let me tell you something. I listened to I had an interview. I interviewed one of the top leaders on the island of Cyprus 2 weeks ago, little bit more than 2 weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, who participated into the 5 parties known as the 5-party negotiations in New York City, because UK was there because of the power and dynamic, a former colony or colonizer, uh, Greece and Turkey, and the 2 so-called sides on the island of Cyprus, the so-called Republic and the so-called Turkish Republic of Cyprus, of Northern Cyprus. So it is 5 of them, and I tried to interview at least 1 or 2 members from each negotiation team. And this negotiator that I was speaking with, I asked the question of how close are we in finding an integrative outcome, meaning an integrative end game solution for Cyprus, and what kind of solutions were the negotiators discussing? And his answer was very simple. He says, I think we are looking something along the lines of a 2-state solution. And then he said to me, are you familiar with this notion of a 2-state solution? Of course, as usual, as an academic, I pretend to be an idiot. I said, no, I have no idea what a 2-state solution is. Why don't you tell me about it? He says, well, the Turks live in the north and then Greeks can live in the south. And then I said, well, I identify myself as a Cypriot. Where should I live? In the north, in the south, in the middle, in the sea, on a boat, on a sailing boat? Where should I live? And where should I bring my children to live next time we visit? So the conversation stopped there. So that's what integrative outcome means. It's all about, is finding a solution that our children can live together and not have to finger point and say, oh, you are one of these guys. Oh, you are the other guys. You have this identity. So we all know how identity gets perplexed and mixed and fuels conflicts. The point is to find solutions that my identity is not going to be an obstacle for anyone. I celebrate my identities and I celebrate your identities. And that's what I'm teaching at my university. How can we celebrate and embrace everybody's identity? And this is what this lesson 5 has to do about. How do we embrace the cultural discourses instead of excluding them? How do we include the territory instead of excluding them or making the point of contention, sovereignty, all of those discourses that often is used or integrated into the political rhetoric to separate people and segregate people and motivate people and militaries to invade and attack one another, including paramilitaries. Instead, how can we get all of those elements and use them towards peace, towards sustainable peace? And this is what comes through lesson 5, and I've seen it happening in Northern Ireland. I remember in one interview with Ian Paisley Sr., God bless his soul, he passed away years ago. He said that one time that peace process in Northern Ireland is an anathema to their identity. He was almost against every peace initiative. Ian Paisley Jr., the son of Senior, Ian Paisley Jr. is a spokesperson of peace and coexistence in the 6 counties, or Northern Ireland as we know it. Not even a generation passed from the father to the son. So many other remarkable examples we've seen happening. And I will stop here. because I think I spoke a lot, more than I was supposed to. I will stop sharing, but I will come back to any of these visuals that you would like me to elaborate more. But more importantly, I think it's in discussion. It's nice to see you all again. I was staring the visuals there, and for a minute, I lost connection with you. Hanan, I promise I will be checking the chat box, and I have not had a single moment to check it. So I know I missed a lot.
So I see that George Douglas would like to ask a question. So George, you could speak up.
Okay, I'll fire away here. One thing I'd like you to talk a little about is how the structure of societies fits into this peace building process. And the example I'd use is that in a free and democratic society, a peace movement can gain political power, gain numbers, power, have the power to elect leaders committed to peace. And you see a process there where you get the leadership in place, and either the leadership in place changes their attitude, or you sometimes replace leadership. And in the case of Israel-Palestine, you've got three distinct areas, each of which have radically different profile in terms of political freedom, freedom of expression via the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Israel. So I'm kind of curious as to why, in some of these charts, that particular issue of how peace movements become empowered and have a voice in choosing leadership and influencing leadership isn't a really important part of the whole process.
George, if I may, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, excellent question, and I hope we get to do some work together and investigate this further. Let me share it with you. You're absolutely right. It's not mentioned directly. It's mentioned indirectly on a much longer document someplace else. But let me share with you a very good example. On the island of Cyprus, in the so-called Republic of Cyprus in the south, the opposition, the left-wing opposition by the socialist/communist party, which is the second largest political party on the island. As you notice, I'm not going to use an example for Israel and Palestine because I don't want us to get into heated debates, and that's not a bad thing. But let me use this example of Mr. Christofias, who was elected by a coalition of left-wing pro-peace parties that aimed for the unification of the island. 5 years in power with based on the paradigm that used to be called, I'm translating here from the local languages to English, is Cyprus' own, Cyprus-led peace process. So they wanted a Cyprus owned by Cypriots, a Cyprus-led peace process by Cypriots. In the so-called South, there was a coalition of left-wing parties led by Mr. Dimitris Christofias. On the so-called northern part of Cyprus, or TRNC, there was a pro-peace coalition as well after 20 years of power by Mr. Rauf Denktash, who was known as division is the only solution. The pro-peace in the northern part was led by Mr. Akinci, Mustafa Akinci, left-wing pro-peace. And it was the only time in history of the island, modern history, where two pro-peace leaders supported by the pro-peace movement, left-wing pro-peace movement, were in power, and we had the hopes The hopes were so high that we thought that in 6 months we will have a solution, and you probably follow the media, you follow what was happening on the island. I was so excited. I packed my suitcase and I went there for 6 months to study, and my wife was home with 2 babies, and I had to come back. Otherwise, it's the American mentality. You're coming back, or I send you a divorce by mail, one of the two. So I had to come back. But we lost that opportunity in George. We missed that opportunity. That's when the opposition, the pro-peace opposition, when they became the leading power, they forgot the promises. That paradigm was lost, unfortunately. I'm sorry, George, I gave a very long answer to a very, 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 very tough question, tough in terms of, gosh, that was a brilliant question, so thank you.
If I could ask you a follow-up kind of to that, should peace activists in situations where the parties maybe have differential political rights and rights of freedom of expression and democracy advocate for more democracy and more freedom of expression? Because without that, how do you affect the changes in leadership that you might need to get to your ultimate goals?
Well, that's a good question. If we look at Northern Ireland, if you recall, and George and colleagues here, and I'm trying not to sound like an academic, that's an identity that conflicts with my approach quite often. If we look at Northern Ireland and following the Good Friday Agreement, and challenges that the challenges for the moderate parties, Huma, SDLP, and many other parties, and in the 6 counties, in the Republic of Ireland, in UK, to bring the so-called paramilitaries along the way, the Ulster Unionist Force, the Provisional IRA, the IRA, which it later on split in so many other organizations, that even the paramilitaries that during the conflict, during the troubles in Northern Ireland were united. During the peace process time, they fell apart. Because of their different paradigms of what peace really means and what conflict really means, and how do we even advocate for those. So that's, I cannot give you a straight answer in 2 minutes because it is such a complex thing. How do we engage paramilitary groups to become stakeholders in the peace process? Yeah. Isn't that how the Oslo II kind of failed? Not entirely, but one of those reasons, the failure to bring in paramilitary groups and extreme groups and opposition groups, that peace meant something different, not the way that the way we all might define lasting peace here in terms of coexistence and sharing the homeland and so many other things.
Tamara wrote a question in the chat. Perhaps Tamara, you want to speak the question?
Sure. Eleftherios, firstly, it's lovely to see you. My question is, I remember one time it was brought up, and this was in regards to Cyprus, but I've also heard it in regards to Israel, Palestine, and I'm sure it translates into other regions, that in conflict regions, the individuals on the sides of the conflict have a common heritage, a common genetic heritage. They share the same DNA, et cetera, et cetera. And I recall that you had said that was a very dangerous topic to get into in regards to working towards peace, this idea that we're all brothers. And I would like to hear again your elaboration on that, because I think I've missed some, or I've forgotten some of those points over the years. If you could please elaborate on when it comes to one's identity, how playing with the DNA card, if you will, is a risky thing to do.
Tamara, thank you for the question. I'm glad to know that we're in the same time zone. Very good question, Tamara. It's, gosh, we have to talk for hours. Let me share a quick example of how the DNA can be used from political leaders to intensify conflict or even spark conflict or sustain conflict or segregate and divide people between us and them. It's the identity card. It's so simple. And person, I am not to mention the name. Tamara, you probably know this individual, lives on the island of Cyprus, a very famous peacemaker, working with youth for 20, 30 years, if I'm not mistaken now. He was a mentor of mine many years ago, 25 plus, and a colleague of mine these days. And who is a geneticist, studying in Germany, genetic biology, has a PhD in research, and among the very few people on the island of Cyprus who started doing DNA research. And one day we all joke about and say, you know, with this DNA tree that they tell us where our ancestors are coming from, and I did mine, and it says that I have a 70% Filipino. I don't know what my connection to the Philippines is. I know I was born and raised my family in Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, but anyhow. So we thought it would be fine to do research and see, based on volunteers, Cypriot volunteers, Greek-speaking, Turkish-speaking, any language-speaking Cypriots who at least live on the island for X amount of years. And close to 1,000 people did the test. It was free of charge because it was expensive at the time, but we found private sponsors, did the test, and it touched upon that identity on the island, where you have Cypriots who identify as Greeks, Cypriots who identify as Turks, Cypriots who identify as British, and so many other nationalities. And in this research, we found that almost 90% Greek-speaking or Turkish-speaking Cypriots, and these were individuals that we couldn't talk to each other because of the status quo division. Our DNA was closer to each other, and actually closer to DNAs of people found in Middle East, in places such as Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria. So Cypriots are a blend of identities, Middle Eastern, Eastern European identities. So we are the same people. Tamara, is that what you are referring to? And imagine now.
No, it was something to how that that can be used to further pry the wedge in between sides within a conflict. That there's a thought that, well, we have this common heritage. Maybe it's not what we expect it to be, but it's a common heritage nonetheless. So we shouldn't. There's no reason, or the reasons are very little for us to have this conflict. And yet, I've forgotten that author's name that you had mentioned, but it's actually can be used to further drive the wedge in between parties that are within a conflict. And I don't know if it was like of us versus them somehow. I don't know if that elaboration helps pinpoint.
Yes, and a number of political parties on the island use identity to either bring people closer together, and in many other instances to push people apart. the right-wing opposition at the moment, it's in government in the so-called Republic of Cyprus that enjoys all of the European Union privileges. It's a right-wing nationalist coalition, extreme right-wing nationalist. According to this political rhetoric and identity formation, Cypriots are Greeks and Turks are just visitors that came to the island 400 years ago, and maybe sometime soon they need to pack and go back to Turkey. That's what they believe. That's not what I believe. It's like telling me, pack my suitcase and leave the United States. How do you feel about that? It's when I hear about building walls and fences and segregating people. It's not only the Arizona-Mexican border, it's also in Baltimore. I live in Baltimore, and I was teaching a course in psychology this summer, and I was telling my students, make sure you get outside. It was before the vaccines. I'm sorry, in the beginning of the spring semester in January, February, and I was telling my students, make sure you get out and walk around the block. And one of my students was saying, Professor Michael, I cannot go out at 9 o'clock and walk around the block. I might get shot. My cousin got shot 2 weeks ago. Okay. I don't want to say bad things about Baltimore, but identity is important. I apologize, Tamara. I know you have, we can talk for hours about your question, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. Otherwise,
I
it's not a
appreciate it.
discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Linat wanted to ask something about slide 4. Linat, can you speak?
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Michael. It was a very interesting, informative presentation. I study political science, and number 4 about like the status quo and how division keeps everyone hostage. I wrote this question: are the people more willing to forge peace than the representatives in government? And I took a course called Nationalism and Interdependence, where we talk about different political theories so we can find out how like we want to argue. And one of these political arguments is that at some point in the future, NGOs or INGOs will become more powerful than sitting governments to create change on behalf of the people. So do you think that that's realistic, that grassroots organizations like Roots could become more powerful and that they gain more support from the people than the government to create change or create peace?
Linat, and I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Linat. And if we have any colleagues in political science, please feel free and join. Linat, my answer it's very simple. Yes, is not power defined in terms of the power paradigm that I have power over you. It's power in terms of making political change in the name of change for restorative justice, for homeland, for protection of everybody's human rights and not segregating anyone, for all of those positive things that many grassroots organizations are holding close to their heart and mind. CFP, Tamara is on the line, the work that Tamara is doing. Now, what happens when all of this power becomes for positive social change, then change their vision and their mission? Okay, that becomes problematic, and we've seen pro-peace political parties who gain power, but then they change their perspective towards lasting peace. Linat, where is home for you? Where are you at the moment? What part of the globe?
I am in Ohio, studying at the College of Worcester.
No, very good, very good, Linat. Let me share with you a personal story. In 2005, 2006, 2007, I was at American University, and I was anti-war person, and still I'm a conscientious objector. And I used to take my peace paradigm students from Tenley Circle on Massachusetts Avenue down to the Washington Mall to protest the war. One day, a foreign journalist asked me, "What are you protesting?" I said, "I protest for the human rights of the soldiers because we want them to come back alive. We want them to come back with 2 legs and 2 arms and a functioning mind." Okay, in 2007, there was a big demonstration. I think 70, 80,000 people were there that day. And I had students who refused to attend those demonstrations, and that's okay. I was doing them in the afternoon as a service learning exercise. If you're gonna be a peacemaker, know how a demonstration looks like first. See how a protest looks like, become part of it. I get on the street and get a little sign, say human rights, protect women, Black Lives Matter, something, get out. Students didn't want to join. In 2007, it was a big protest, and the keynote speaker was a senator named Barack Obama, along with Samantha Power. You know Samantha, she wrote a book. It's somewhere up there, actually. It's funny, actually I have it here. This is Samantha Power. This is one of her books. It says, "A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide." Begins with the Holocaust and goes on and on and on. I interviewed Samantha when she was an ambassador in New York City. Of course, she changed quite a bit from this book to what she believes nowadays, but that's okay, that's me. God bless her soul anyways. Barack Obama, John Pendergrass, and many, many other famous peace, anti-war and peacemakers were there giving long speeches. And later on, a few months later, when Obama won the election, do you know what happened to the peace movement? It died. There was not a single demonstration after that. That's an example of where the peace movement gets hijacked by a political elite. And there was not a single. I stopped teaching peace paradigms in 2008 because there was not a freaking demonstration to take my students anymore. It was all got hijacked. And those nonprofits who started, I mentioned a few names of those big names that started those nonprofits, the Enough Project, the Answer, those were the big movements. They all became what? Do you recall? They all got positions in the Obama administration. I can name all of them. I was there. I was among the few who did not accept the position. I'm a kumbaya guy. I'm not for governments. Linat, I apologize. I gave you a very, very long answer to a very simple question. So that's another reason not to ask me another question because I'm running low on coffee as well.
No, thank you. It's a very good question. It's an interesting answer, or an interesting answer. Rather, I shouldn't tell myself it's a good question.
Something to think about. When pro-peace oppositions and revolutionaries become government, how are they going to, what kind of politics are they going to follow after that? And it's not black and white. I might make it sound black and white. It's because of my personality, but it's not black and white. I'm also optimist.
Richard Rosenfeld writes in the chat. Richard, yeah, I see you on the screen. You want to tell Eleftherios what the question is?
Sure. Well, I'm thinking that the issue between Palestinians and Israelis, it really cuts to the core for some of the some of the core feelings that each has really has to do with how they feel the state is theirs. So my question is, how can Palestinians and Jewish Israelis live together in a shared state without giving up each side's dream to have a Jewish state and a Palestinian state of their own? Is a paradigm shift possible? A shift of what it means to live in a state that reflects one's own particular values?
Absolutely, Richard. That's what I believe. Absolutely, yes. That's the short answer. The long answer. In one of the in Mahatma Gandhi ashram, a mother, you all know the story. One of the mothers take the child, so Mahatma Gandhi will punish the child by eating chocolate. And Mahatma Gandhi asked the mother, "Why should I punish the child by eating chocolate? I like chocolate. If I believe in peace, yes, it will be peace. If we live in communities when and where everything about the paradigm of hatred, the paradigms of division, the paradigm of us and them always taking away our identity, then that's what we believe. I grew up on an island for 18 years, told, not for my parents, because my parents were an exception to that rule, but by my neighbors, my school, the educational discourse in the south of Cyprus, the political discourse. Every day, Richard, day and night, we are refugees. We've been ethnically cleansed. We've been attacked because of our religion. And then I joined the military, Richard. I served into the Cyprus National Guard for 28 months and became a conscientious objector after that. And then I meet Turkish-speaking Cypriots first time and I speak to them in Greek, and they speak back to me in Turkish. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, you look like my brother." "Oh, so you are the other side. And what do you do?" "I'm a poet." "And what do you do?" "I'm a student." And then he recites a poem from me. And it was a poem by a Greek writer. So this is a Turkish guy, a Turkish Cypriot guy, whatever. I'm trying to put my mindset onto the 18, 19, 20-year-old, where it's been indoctrinated by the cultural discourse, by the educational discourse on the island, to believe in certain things. And then when we see a contradiction, we get confused. And sometimes contradictions is what and shift that paradigm. And Tamara is on the line. She interacts with many youth, and I do the same as most of you. And we do so many exercises, asking the young generation to tell us their story and tell the story. So the so-called, I always use the so-called other side can listen to that story and see the similarities, not the differences. And that's when all of those contradictions and the moments come in, that we realize that, yes, we can coexist. And my identity, it should not be an obstacle to your existence, to your identity. It should be celebrated.
Victoria has a question that she wrote in the chat. Victoria, would you like to unmute yourself and say the question?
Yes, hello. Yes, so my question is about kind of what we've been seeing in kind of, I suppose, across the West in general over the past few years, where like identity politics has really become a lot more prominent in culture in general. And I wondered if you think that is something that potentially can create more divisions and more conflict, or if you see it as sort of people connecting more with their various identities as a positive thing.
Victoria, I apologize. I missed the last part of your question. I don't know if it's my Wi-Fi connection here. I really apologize. Can you please repeat?
Yes, yeah, no problem. So I was speaking about identity politics in the West, and if you think that people thinking much more about their identity and really naming all the aspects of their identity, kind of almost like in a sort of tribal way, if you think that potentially will create more conflict, or if you see it as a positive thing.
Yes, I thank you, Victoria. And Victoria, where is home for you, if I may ask?
I'm from Scotland, but I'm living in London.
Thank you, Victoria. Beautiful places. Victoria, that's a tough question, very tough one. But if I will use again myself as an example. If I'm raised in a community that I'm told only one thing, that my identity is superior than anybody else's identity, yes, I will fall in that notion. The question is, when does identity become so salient so that can be mobilized by a group of individuals, and to the point that we see violent clashes? And that's human history in a way. Not because of identity. Identity doesn't cause conflict. It's the way we incorporate identity to fuel conflict, to separate, and there are many stages, if we want, of those theories, from the very beginning of separating people all the way to institutionalize some form of action against a group of people. The Holocaust is an example of it, of how propaganda was used to segregate. Every genocide we have witnessed in our lifetime, and we are not that old, Rwanda's, the Bosnia's, the Holocaust, the famines, and all of those genocides and femicides and infocides, and that we are witnessing on a daily basis. Identity does not cause conflict. It's the way the identity card is used by somebody or some political elites to segregate and eventually segregate, separate people, and eventually cause those conflicts. I don't know what else to say. There are many examples from Northern Ireland. It's the Scottish question as well. Can Scottish move towards their own independence? Absolutely. Would that cause a violent conflict? Why? It shouldn't cause any conflict. In the European Union, where identities should be celebrated and embraced, communities of people should be able to exercise their human rights.
Yeah, that's great.
That's what I think. I might be wrong, and for as long as I'm wrong, I'm okay, for assuming there won't be any violence after it if something happens in these communities of people. A good example is not Jerry Adams, but Jerry Kelly. Jerry Kelly was high up in the Irish Republican Army organization. I had one-on-one conversation with him many years ago about the Good Friday or the Belfast Agreement. I'm using an example, Victoria, you are closer to your home. And Jerry, I asked Jerry Kelly, what is this peace accord all about? And he said to me in few words, this is to prevent the house from catching fire again. And if there is a fire to help us constructively, peoples of Northern Ireland, to find a solution and not go back to violence. That's how he described to me the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Accords. And you probably know the St. Andrews Agreement on decommissioning for the paramilitary groups to decommission, to put weapons beyond use. So if something happens, something bad happens, find a political solution, go back to negotiations, don't go back to guns, don't go back to the missiles, don't go back to shooting bullets at each other again.
Perhaps I'll chime in and say something.
Thank you.
In response to Victoria's question, that question actually divides peacemakers here in Israel-Palestine, I think. The answer to that question, the way we deal with that question. A lot of peacemaking in Israel-Palestine, at least until the present, and certainly until 7 years ago, was based on the assumption that identity is bad for peace. That to the degree that we're able to overcome our sectarian different particular identities, we'll be better able, Israelis and Palestinians, to live together. And according to that paradigm, religion is bad. Religion divides. Israelis are Jews and Palestinians are mostly Muslims, some Christians. If we're able to overcome our separate identities, and we'll be able to live together as human beings. And I think that certainly to a certain degree, the Oslo Accords were based on that, on overcoming particularism, overcoming religion, overcoming what was separating us, and create a more universalist human identity. And at least here in Israel-Palestine, it didn't work. And one of the reasons might be because most of the people are stuck in their identities. Now, stuck is a negative word. And that's the way the peacemakers looked at it negatively. But I think that in the past 5, 6, 7 years here in Israel-Palestine, more and more particularists have entered into the peace camp. Roots is an example of that, making the claims, taking out the position that at least here in the Middle East, we cannot go beyond our identities. It's for better or for worse, perhaps for better, perhaps for worse, but the given is that identities are strong. And even if the strong identities are found among a minority, but the minority is strong enough to blow up any peace that the universalists may create, let's try to create an understanding, a peace, a reconciliation that recognizes, respects, and cherishes the identities, the strong identities on both sides. To put it differently, yes, religion has been part of the problem, but we can't get rid of religion. Religion therefore has to become part of the solution. I would say certainly Roots is based upon that assumption. Just let me add, when anyone wants to read about it, not about Roots in particular, but about this dealing with identity as part of peacemaking. Yes, no. One of the last books of a rabbi just passed away a few months ago, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, was exactly on this question. The book is called Not in God's Name. And he deals explicitly with this question. Can we overcome identity? Is it good for making peace? Or can we create peace through celebration of separate identities? Linat.
I have a question. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the idea that we can have peace by overcoming identity, specifically in Israel-Palestine, does kind of confuse me, just given the fact that like we're taught from an early age to hate each other, to resent each other, to be ignorant of the other person's existence. So I guess my question is, why was the instinct to overcome essentially the core of the problem? Like, why wasn't it more clear to integrate our conflicting identities into peace, into sustainable peace sooner? Like, it seems kind of obvious to me, but why wasn't it obvious then?
You know, I actually can see the point of those who disagree with me. I can see it very well. If I'm a secular Muslim living in Ramallah, and I see that all of the violence, I'm exaggerating, but I see if all the violence and all of the negativity and all of the aggression is coming from those of my people who embrace that particularist identity of Islam, and if I want peace, I'm going to say I want to jettison all that particularism that separates me from that causes conflict. And same thing on the Jewish side. If I'm a secular Israeli in Tel Aviv and I see that the religious people, the Orthodox people, the right-wing settlers are causing the conflict, so I want to jettison that part of my people's identity. Let them go to hell. They're causing other problems. Let's just live together as human beings. Why do we have to identify ourselves as Jews or as Muslims? Why can't we just live as human beings? That I get it completely. I think it makes perfect sense. It just didn't work because a certain part of the population doesn't want to go there.
Yeah, well, it just seems bizarre that you have to speak on behalf of all of your people. Like, you know, if, for example, if I'm the secular Jew, then I have to decide that the, you know, Orthodox settler is wrong. And that, you know, even if me and that person are both Israeli, that I am more correct and I am more able to understand the peace process than they are. That just seems very bizarre to me. Because on one hand, we're like very unified and we're taught, especially like because we're all supposed to serve IDF and all this stuff, to be, you know, one, you know, is, you know, the people Israel, and to be united in that way. But it's just interesting how, of course, two Jews, their opinions, we can't agree. It's very bizarre to me. I don't know. Okay, it's not a specific question. I'll stop.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
George.
Oh, this is kind of following up on this exact discussion. There's a word that seems to have fallen out of favor or popular usage that I think describes the issue here with identity, and it's demagoguery. And demagoguery is utilizing identity to inflame prejudice, and it's a tool that that leaders, you know, utilize. But there's nothing unique about identity that necessarily creates prejudice. And for whatever reason, that word has kind of fallen out of favor. But when I read identity politics, 3/4 of the time I think of demagoguery on the part of politicians and leaders. So, and again, I don't know why that word is not popular, because I think it accurately describes what goes on, but it's not intrinsic to identity, if that's a fair question.
George, I will mention Bosnia-Herzegovina briefly, but I think Amy, I'd like to share one quick example with you from the old Yugoslav times and what I witnessed there. But I think Amy, I see a hand, and Amy, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Please,
do you want to answer your question first, or do you want me to go first? Or
Amy, go ahead, because if I answer, then becomes a monologue. So let's stick to the dialogue.
okay. I was just going to say, related to this topic of, you know, being religious or secular and perspectives, and like, I think there's definitely a spectrum of how how tightly people identify with religion and how it informs their values and perspectives. You know, years ago, somebody once asked me if I was religious, and my answer to them was, if you think of the sociological definition of rituals and routines that we do to connect with God and other people, I think all humans are religious, right? If it's not in a formal religion, it's with a country's flag and the celebration days of their country, or it's with the sport team and the symbols. There's discussions. I made my degrees in human kinetics of, can sport be classified as a religion when people start wearing symbols and doing rituals before they serve or before they do something. You know, you look at the final, you know, the big Super Bowl or the big, you know, event that everyone knows would be at a certain time of the year, and people do certain things. But in our nature, we have symbols and we have rituals that connect us together. And I think there's a spectrum with all of us as to how much of those things are tied to a religion, how much of those things are tied to a political party, how much of those things are tied to a country, how much of those things are tied to our leisure and our social activities and connections. You know, like some people who watch, they do animated movies and they dress up in costumes and they go to these events once a year. So I think there's a spectrum of those types of things, of where they come from and then how much they affect our values. And my father, he's a professor emeritus of the Western Christian Church. And even though I'm no longer a Christian myself, one of the things that he would say is, one of the brilliances he sees of whether it's Christianity or religion in general is its ability to adapt. And I would say that even among all religions and among all people, whether they're secular or atheist or what ways we connect religiously with other people, that there's still a spectrum amongst all these of how much we adapt. How much do we get to know people different from ourselves and incorporate that, incorporate changes in science and in historical knowledge, and how much we feel we want to stay the way that we are. And so we see subcultures among all religions and among all cultures of people who want to keep things exactly the same, and people who are looking for how we can adapt in ways that makes everybody's life more comfortable and more peaceful. And so it is, that's just something I think that I've seen, that we can't generalize, right? Like there's extremes within a religion and there's extremes within atheism or within nationalism. And I wonder if there's some common, I mean, I like that idea that however we do identify ourselves, that people need to feel like they can have some framework for identity and social community. So how do we spread approaches and tools and skills that wherever people are at, those things increase the ability to understand more varieties of people and groups, and more skills to relate with more different people and groups, and more ability to have resilience ourselves to adapt to the changes that happen in our society and in the world. Because I think as we build those awarenesses and skills, then we all will be able to, you know, learn better and collaborate better together.
Hanana, Amy, I agree with you. I don't know if there is a need for me to give any answer. The only personal thing I can share with you is one of my doctoral advisors, who is a very famous person in cognitive psychology, one of the top 3-4 names in the United States. At least that's how he likes to see himself. Used to say to me, and that goes back about 25 years ago, used to say to me that identities are fixed. This is a top-notch former president of the American Psychological Association, used to argue identities are fixed. I departed from that very on because there was nothing fixed about me. in my identity. And my argument from that point on, and that's why he did not chair my dissertation, is that I believe identities are fluid, very fluid. His argument is that you are born with that identity and you stick with it. My argument is that identities are fluid. I don't know what else to say. I'm with you. George, my last example, I believe, George, the question came from you. One of the Slavia in Sarajevo back in the late 90s. I asked the same question. How did the Yugoslav army know who is who? How did they know who's a Muslim, who is a Serbian Orthodox, who is a Croat Catholic? If everybody lived together in these communities as one identity known as the Tito, Joseph Tito's vision of Yugoslavia, one identity. And they share with me, they show pictures with me, and the actual evidence that I saw in apartment buildings where the Yugoslav army went in, asking neighbors who is who. And everybody who was a Bosnian Muslim on the mailbox will be a star, a little mark. That's how the Yugoslav army got to know who is a Muslim, who is an Orthodox Christian, who is a Catholic in Sarajevo. Before then, even the people I was asking with, have you used those identities? No. And it's the example that many Serbian Christians use names that are predominantly Muslim names, but they didn't matter in former Yugoslavia. And we have so many examples of how that segregation started in the beginning of the 90s, the collapse that led to the collapse of Yugoslavia, and eventually the ethnic cleansing, that even the military didn't know who is who. They had to threaten and ask the neighbors to indicate, to finger point who is Muslim, who goes to the church and who goes to 20 other religious to your question, George. I hope that's helpful. Amy, I hope I'm not trying to give you an answer, a philosophical or a practical one. As a guest of honor, I gave me that privilege, but that comes to an end. So Hanan, I'm back to you. I'll be happy to stay another 10, 15 minutes if there are questions. And
Thank you. Fascinating. Actually, I'm not going to let you stay for another 15 minutes. It's already an hour and a half. That's, I think, enough of your time. I would like to close with some housekeeping. Just to remind everyone about the Roots website, please visit our website, friendsofroots.net, friendsofroots.net. And there on the website, if you're so able, you can donate to Roots. We certainly need your support and your help to continue our holy work in Israel, Palestine. Also on Facebook, you could like us, Friends of Roots there also. On Instagram, I believe it's Building Peace. And I'd lastly like to mention that Roots is doing its first post-pandemic speaking tour in the US in November. The whole month of November until the 21st will be in the US. And if you'd like to invite us to your communities, please be in contact with us through Facebook, through the website, or if you have my email, by emailing me. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to Eleftherios for the insights and the wisdom. Good day, good night, good morning, good afternoon.
thank you, Hanan.
Bye.
Hanan, I will, if you